Hello, hello. Wonderful to have you here. I hope you're having a great day. It's a beautiful day here in the countryside. And what I thought I'd do in today's video is to ask some questions. The point of practice in Buddhism, certainly in early Buddhism, is to become aware of our clinging, the way we cling to things, the way we cling to ideas and views. And in becoming aware of that clinging, we begin to see its effect upon us, and so we begin to release that clinging. And one of the strategies we can use to become aware of this clinging that we tend to persist in doing is to ask ourselves questions. Now, this is far from a perfect strategy. It's one of many strategies we can use because, there's a big difference between asking yourself the question, what if I had a house fire, and actually having a house fire. I mean, you can ask me, if I had asked myself 6 months ago, what if I had a house fire, my internal reflections would be quite different from the ones that I have now, having actually been through a house fire. So it's not perfect. But in any event, it can give us a beginning and can begin to give us an insight into what we should be aware of, the kinds of problems, the kind of issues, the kind of tensions that we may have within us. So I'm going to ask a number of questions, and these are questions about Buddhism and Buddhist practice itself, because we can also cling to these things. So make them an object of contemplation, I would say. Now, some of these questions were answered in one way or another by the Buddha, others were not. There's only a few of them, but anyway, this is going to give you an idea of things to contemplate, questions to contemplate. The first question that I would ask you to contemplate is, what if there is no real perfect enlightenment? That is to say, what if enlightenment itself never really gets to the complete extinction of greed, hatred, and delusion? Or what if that extinction is not permanent? What if it can wax and wane when we have it? It's just something to contemplate. Another question might be, what if there's no rebirth? What happens then? What if there are none of the supposed supernatural abilities that we read about in the early texts? What if our karma is due simply to what other people notice in us and infer about our actions, and not something that, for example, goes on into future lives? And what if the Buddha himself did not exist? Now, to be clear, I'm not necessarily asserting that any of this is so. My own opinions and beliefs are not really the point of this video. What I'm asking you to do is to contemplate them for yourself and to see what happens, to see what arises when you undertake these kinds of contemplations. Now, in all of these cases, the beliefs, the views that we hold with respect to these kinds of claims is not due to our own eyewitness evidence. We won't have seen it literally for ourselves. We're going to be having to infer things, or we're going to be having to go on the evidence and opinions, the authority of other people who we consider to be authority figures of one kind or another, people who we believe in. Or we'll be going on tradition, the opinions that are passed down through one or another of the traditions that we believe in. Now, these sources of evidence, that is to say, authority or tradition, the Buddha himself did not consider particularly probative. He didn't consider them strong sources of evidence. In one early sutta, the Buddha very famously asserted that we should not go by oral transmission, by lineage, by testament, by canonical authority. We shouldn't rely solely on logic or inference or solely by reasoned contemplation, and we shouldn't go by the acceptance of a view after consideration or the appearance of competence of the person speaking to us, and we shouldn't simply think that the ascetic, the person who's teaching us, is our respected teacher, and so we should simply believe these things based on that. That is to say that all of these various methods that we come to believe things methods that are essentially based on authority of one kind or another, tradition of one kind or another, or simply our own reasoning it out for ourselves, these are not particularly good sources of evidence for us. They can be wrong in various regards. And as a result, doubts can arise. If we hear somebody telling us something, we may believe them, but not 100%, where there's still a little bit of doubt remaining. And doubt can be a source of hindrance to us along the path. Because if doubts arise, then it stops us really from moving forward. Sometimes then it can be useful to allow these doubts a space to exist and contemplate them and see them for what they are, so that we can overcome them, so that we can see beyond them, either through understanding the material more deeply, for seeing it for ourselves, which is really what the Buddha wants us to do, or by realizing that the doubt that we thought was so important actually isn't, and that we can continue moving forward even while we hold those doubts in the backs of our minds. So once again, what happens to our practice if we hold that there is no permanent enlightenment, that enlightenment is either impure, that it's not complete, or that it's not permanent? There's a very interesting statement by the Zen master Shunryu Suzuki, where he says, "There are, strictly speaking, no enlightened people. There is only enlightened activity." Now, there's lots of ways to interpret that. Of course, there aren't, strictly speaking, enlightened people, because there aren't selves that are enlightened. There aren't permanent things that are enlightened. We know that from the teachings of early Buddhism. There is no permanent, essential, unchanging self. And so therefore there, strictly speaking, aren't any enlightened people. But we can also think of this in a different way, that enlightenment comes across in particular actions, in particular thoughts, in particular manifestations of ourselves from moment to moment. And so to that extent, does it really matter? Do we really know whether enlightenment is permanent or not? Again, does it matter? If we can move along the path in an upward direction where we're seeing results from moment to moment for ourselves directly, do we need to have this belief in an ultimate enlightenment? A question that I would leave open to you. Or another question that I raised is there rebirth? Is rebirth real? Once again, in the sutta that I just cited, where the Buddha was talking about all these various forms of knowledge which really aren't perfect and therefore we shouldn't rely upon, the Buddha also contemplates the possibility that rebirth isn't real. And what he says is, if there's no rebirth and we're behaving the way we ought to behave, we're behaving skillfully, we're behaving ethically, we're behaving calmly, without enmity, kindly towards others, then we're going to get the benefits that we want in this very life that is our only life. And so, whether or not there's rebirth, we should be behaving in a certain way. What if there are no supernatural abilities? What if indeed the Buddha himself didn't exist? Perhaps it was all a concoction of some kind. Now, I have my own views on these, but I don't want to get those across in this video because my own views are not really important here. What's important is how you yourself approach these very questions, how they revolve around in your mind, what kinds of issues they bring up for you, what kinds of concerns, tightness, anger, perhaps, worry they bring up for you, and how you deal with that. And in any event, if you've watched some of my other videos, you'll have an idea of what I think about some of these things. But once again, bringing up my own views here, you're just going to either agree with me or disagree with me. That's not the point of the video. The point is to see for yourself. Now, what I will say, however, is that many of these kinds of questions are considered anathema in other religions. Viewpoints such as these seen in, let's say, Christianity, or at least certain forms of Christianity, or certain forms of Islam or other religions would be seen as very problematic because, for example, the question, did Jesus exist or was Jesus the Son of God? If we really contemplate those, they might undermine the entire point of the religion. There would be no point to practice if these things were not held to be true. So my question here in this video is, to what extent is the same thing the case in Buddhism as well? To take the example I gave before, if there was no permanent enlightenment, would that mean that our Buddhist practice was therefore worthless, the sort of thing that we shouldn't engage in? Something in any way to contemplate for yourself. And if you want to hear more about one of these issues, I did a prior video on the question as to whether the Buddha really existed, and I come up with some reasons why I think one of these things rather than the other, and I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen in case you haven't seen it, or in case you want to see it again to refresh your memory. If you're getting something out of these questions and concerns and videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and see if you want to help support the channel. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.